You wake in a city that doesn't know you're here. The apartment complex holds 200 souls, maybe more, and you couldn't name 5 of them if your life depended on it. You hear them sometimes. Footsteps above, a door closing down the hall, the muffled argument bleeding through the walls at 2 in the morning. But they exist to you only as sounds, as evidence of other lives happening in parallel to yours, never intersecting, never quite touching. In the morning, you'll pass someone in the elevator and you'll both look at your phones, and that will be the extent of it. This is normal. This is how we live now. You move through your day and the world flows past you like water, touching nothing, leaving no mark. The barista makes you coffee without looking at your face. The grocery store clerk scans your items and says, "Have a nice day," in a voice that could be addressing anyone, everyone, no one. You are a transaction, a data point, a body moving through space. The algorithm knows you better than any human does. It knows what you'll buy, what you'll watch, what will keep you scrolling at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come. It serves you content tailored to your desires, your fears, your secret shames, but it doesn't know your name. Not really, not in any way that matters. At night you scroll through faces of people you used to know, people who once meant something, people whose lives now unfold in curated squares of light that you consume with your thumb. You see their vacations, their children, their carefully framed moments of joy, and you feel something you can't quite name. Not envy exactly. It's not longing. Something older than that. Something that sits in your chest like a weight, like hunger, like the memory of a place you've never been. The restlessness comes in waves. You rearrange your apartment. You start new hobbies and abandon them. You swipe through faces on dating apps looking for something, though you're not sure what. Connection, maybe. Recognition. Someone who might see you, really see you, in a way that feels less like performance and more like coming home. But home to what? You don't know. You've never known. That's the problem. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by millions of people and known by none of them. It's different from the loneliness of isolation. It's the loneliness of being a ghost in your own life, of moving through a world that has no particular need for you. A no place set aside where you are expected, necessary, woven into the fabric of daily existence. You could disappear tomorrow and the city would close over the space you left like water. Your job would post your position. Your apartment would be rented to someone new. The algorithm would stop serving you content, and that would be that. You tell yourself this is freedom, mobility, choice. You could leave tomorrow, move to another city, reinvent yourself completely. No one would stop you. No one is holding you here except your lease and your job, and the vague sense that everywhere else would be exactly the same. Different buildings, different faces, same essential anonymity. Same weightless drift through days that blur together into months, years, a life. Sometimes you catch yourself wondering what it would feel like to be missed. Not in the abstract way of social media condolences, not in the professional way of being a valued team member, but missed in the bone-deep way that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. To be a thread in a fabric that would show your absence as a whole, a gap, a wrongness in the pattern. You wonder what it would feel like to be known so thoroughly that your presence or absence actually mattered to the functioning of a world. This wondering usually comes late at night, in that space between wakefulness and sleep, when your defenses are down and you can't quite maintain the story you tell yourself about your life. It comes when you're tired enough to be honest. You're lonely. Not for company. You can get company. There are always people around. But for place, for mattering, for being held in the collective memory of something that preceded you and will outlast you and needs you while you're here. The modern world will tell you this longing is nostalgia, and nostalgia is a lie, a trick of memory that edits out the hardship and leaves only the golden glow. And that's partly true. But it's not the whole truth, because what you're longing for isn't really the past. You're longing for the conditions the past created, conditions that anchored identity in place and time, and community in ways we've systematically dismantled in pursuit of other goods. Efficiency, growth, individual autonomy. These aren't nothing. But they cost something too. You feel it most acutely in moments of transition, in the gaps between one thing and another. And moving to a new apartment and realizing no one will help you carry boxes because you don't know anyone well enough to ask. Celebrating a promotion alone because the friends you once had are scattered across time zones, reduced to annual holiday messages and the occasional comment on a photo. Getting sick and understanding with sudden clarity that you could die in this apartment and no one would notice for days, maybe weeks, until the smell or the missed rent payment finally drew attention. This is the untold bargain of modern life. We traded the claustrophobia of being known for the freedom of being anonymous, and we got both the liberation and the cost. No one monitors your comings and goings, but no one notices when you're gone. No one judges your choices, but no one cares enough to intervene when you're making terrible ones. And you can be whoever you want, but you have to become that person alone, without the scaffolding of role and expectation and inherited identity that once made the self feel stable, solid, real. The question that haunts you, the one you can't quite articulate even to yourself, is this: what are you when no one is watching? What remains of the self when it's not reflected back through the eyes of people who know your history, your family, your place in the order of things? Who are you when you're just you, alone in your apartment, untethered from the dailiness of being known? You are more free than any human in history. You can go anywhere, be anything, choose and unchoose your identity with a fluidity that would have been unimaginable to your ancestors. But freedom, you're learning, is not the same as belonging. And belonging is what you're hungry for, even if you don't have the words for it yet. Even if you've been taught to be suspicious of it, to see it as constraint rather than gift. There are nights when this hunger becomes so acute, you can feel it in your body, a physical ache, a homesickness for a home you've never had. You scroll through images of small towns, of villages clustered around churches or town squares, of places where the buildings themselves seem to hold memory, where people have been born and died in the same houses for generations. You know this is sentimental. You know these places have their own suffocations, their own forms of violence and exclusion. But still you look. Still you wonder. What you're looking at, though you don't quite know it yet, is not a place. It's a structure of feeling. To a way of being human that organized itself around permanence and proximity and the slow accumulation of shared history. You're looking at the visible evidence of a world where identity wasn't something you chose or constructed or curated, but something that grew out of your relationship to land and kin and the rhythms of work that everyone around you understood, because they were doing it too. The bell tower in those village photos, you probably don't even notice it consciously, but it's almost always there. That was the technology of belonging. Not the bell itself, but what it represented. A sound that organized time communally, that called people to the same moments, that meant the same thing to everyone who heard it. Morning, noon, evening, danger, celebration, death. The bell didn't know your name, but the person who rang it did. Why, and so did everyone who heard it and knew whose door would be draped in black, whose child was being baptized, whose fields were on fire. You live in a world of personalized notifications now. Every ping is meant for you alone, calling you to a moment no one else shares. You are always being summoned and never being gathered. It's a different thing entirely. The bell called you into community. Your phone calls you out of it. But you didn't come here to be lectured about phones. You came here because you can't sleep, because the restlessness has followed you to bed again, because some part of you knows that what you're really trying to do is find your way back to something we've lost, or find your way forward to something new, or at least understand why the present feels so unmoored, so provisional. was so much like waiting for your real life to begin. So let's go back, not to idealize or to escape, but to understand. Let's go back to the village, to the bell, to the life that organized itself around the assumption that you belonged to a place, and it belonged to you, for better and worse, in sickness and health, till death did you part. Let's look clearly at what that was, what it cost, what it gave, and what happened when we walked away from it. Let's see if we can find, in the ruins of that old belonging, something that might help us understand the particular ache of being alive right now. The village sits in a valley, which is where villages usually sit if they have any choice in the matter. Valleys mean water, and water means life, means crops, means you might survive the winter. The houses are close together, are close enough that you can hear your neighbor's rooster and smell their dinner cooking and know when they're fighting, because voices carry through the thin walls and the even thinner windows. You are born in one of these houses, not in a hospital, not with doctors and epidurals and a team of specialists, but in the bed where you were conceived, with the midwife who delivered your mother and your grandmother, with the same prayers spoken over you that have been spoken over babies in this village for longer than anyone can remember. Your mother screams, and your father paces outside, and the women of the village bring what they can: water, clean cloths, prayers, their presence. When you finally arrive, bloody and furious, you are not entering an anonymous world. You are entering a story already in progress. A story in which there is a space waiting for you, a role, a name that carries history. Your name is not yours alone. It belonged to your grandfather, or your aunt, or some other relative whose life and death are still remembered in the village. When people say your name, they're not just addressing you. They're invoking that lineage, placing you in a web of relation that stretches back beyond your understanding. You are John Miller's grandson. You are Mary's niece. You are the third child, the one who came after the two who died in infancy, the one your parents see as both blessing and risk, because they know how fragile life is here, how quickly a child can be taken. The house you grow up in is small, one room, maybe two if your family is prosperous. The animals sleep nearby, sometimes in the house itself during winter. Because their body heat is heat, you can't afford to waste. The smell of them becomes the smell of home. Hay and dung and wool and the warm animals stink of survival. You sleep with your siblings, 2 or 3 to a bed, under blankets your grandmother wove from wool, your mother spun from sheep your father tends. There is no privacy. There is no alone. There is only the constant press of other bodies, other lives, other needs. You learn early that you are not the center of anything. The world does not arrange itself around your desires. You wake when the rooster crows, not when you're rested. You eat what there is, not what you want. You wear what can be made or handed down or traded for, and you wear it until it falls apart. And then the scraps become rags, and the rags become bandages or stuffing or tinder for the fire. Nothing is wasted. Nothing can be wasted. Waste is death here. By the time you're 5 or 6, you're working. Not playing at work, but doing actual labor that matters to the survival of your family. Feeding chickens, gathering eggs, watching the younger children, pulling weeds, carrying water. Your hands are always dirty, always busy. You learn the world through touch and repetition and the slow accumulation of skill. How to tell when the bread is ready to come out. How to calm a frightened goat. How to tie the knots that will hold in a storm. No one sits you down and explains these things. You watch, you try, you fail, you try again. Your mother corrects you without meanness. Your father shows you again, slower this time. And eventually your hands know what to do without your mind having to think about it. The rhythm of your life is set by seasons and by light. In summer, you work from before dawn until after dusk, every hand needed for the endless labor of planting and tending and harvesting. In winter, The days are shorter, but no less full. Animals still need feeding, wood still needs chopping, tools need mending. Nothing stops. There is no weekend, no vacation, no separation between work and life, because they are the same thing. Your work is your life. Your life is your work. And everyone around you is engaged in the same struggle, the same endless negotiation with soil and weather, and the fundamental problem of survival. The church bell marks the day. You hear it when you wake, calling you to consciousness, reminding you that you are part of something larger than your own small struggle. You hear it at midday, when the sun is highest and your back aches from bending and you stop for bread and water. You hear it at evening, when the light is fading and you're finally allowed to rest. And you hear it on Sunday, calling you to church, to the one day when work stops and the village gathers and you remember why you're doing this, what it's all for. Church is not optional. It's not a matter of personal belief or individual spiritual seeking. It's the center of village life, the place where everything important happens. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, the reading of announcements, the settling of disputes. The priest is not just a spiritual guide. He's often the only person in the village who can read and write, the keeper of records, the mediator of conflicts, the voice of authority that extends beyond your family and into the realm of cosmic order. You sit in the same pew your family has always sat in, because there's an order to these things, a hierarchy that everyone understands and no one questions. The lord of the manor sits in front. The prosperous farmers sit in the middle. The poor sit in the back. You know where you belong without being told. You can feel it in the way people move, the way they defer or command, the subtle choreography of a society that doesn't need to explain itself because it's been this way forever. The sermon is in Latin, which you don't understand, but that's not the point. The point is the ritual, the communal participation in something ancient and unchanging. The point is that everyone you know is here, in this space, at this moment, oriented toward the same thing. Your neighbor is here, the one whose pig got into your garden last week. The smith is here, whose daughter you'll probably marry if your fathers can agree on terms. The widow is here, the one everyone helps because that's what you do. That's how you ensure that when your time comes, you'll be helped too. After church, there's socializing, which is not leisure exactly, but the necessary work of maintaining the social fabric. Gossip is not entertainment, it's information. You learn who's sick, who's struggling, who needs help, who's getting above themselves and needs to be brought down a peg. You learn the marriages being arranged, the feuds being nursed, the debts being called in. You learn your place in all of this, constantly, through 1,000 tiny interactions that remind you where you stand, what's expected, what's permitted, what will get you shunned or worse. Because the village enforces its norms ruthlessly, it has to. There's no room for deviation when survival depends on cooperation. If you don't help with the harvest, you don't eat. If you don't maintain your section of the common fence, everyone's cattle get out and everyone suffers. If you steal, if you lie, if you violate the trust that holds this fragile community together, you will be punished. Not by distant authorities, but by the people you see every day. The people whose opinion of you is not abstract, but material, not optional, but essential to your continued existence. You are never anonymous here. Never. Everyone knows your business because everyone's business is everyone's business. The walls are thin, and the houses are close, and the village is small enough that you can walk from one end to the other in 10 minutes. There are no secrets. When you court someone, the whole village knows. When you fight with your spouse, everyone hears. When you succeed, they celebrate with you, genuinely, because your success means more resources for everyone. When you fail, they help you, not out of charity, but out of self-interest, because next time, it might be them. And the web of mutual obligation is what keeps everyone alive. This is suffocating in ways we can barely imagine now. You cannot be whoever you want to be. You are born into a role and you'll die in that role, and your children will inherit that role. And questioning it is not just impractical, it's unthinkable. If your father is a farmer, you'll be a farmer. If you're born a woman, your life will be defined by the needs of men, your father, your husband, your sons. If you're born with a mind that questions, with desires that don't fit the available roles, with a self that chafes against the expectations placed upon it, you will suffer in ways that have no language, no solution, no escape. But here's what we forget when we congratulate ourselves on leaving that world behind. You were held. Constrained, yes. Limited, absolutely. But held. You knew where you belonged. You knew what was expected. You knew that your existence mattered to the people around you. Not because you were special or talented or self-actualized, but because you were part of a system of mutual dependence that couldn't function without you. When you were born, the midwife knew your mother's body because she'd delivered half the village. When you were sick, the healing woman knew what herbs to use because she'd learned from her grandmother, who'd learned from hers, knowledge passed down through generations of paying attention to what worked. When you married, the whole village came, not because they particularly liked you, but because marriages were important to everyone. They created alliances, resolved disputes, redistributed resources, wove the social fabric tighter. When you died, you were not alone. You died in your bed, in your house, surrounded by people who'd known you your whole life. The priest came and administered last rites. Your family gathered and said goodbye. And when you were gone, the bell tolled, and everyone in the village stopped what they were doing and listened and counted the strikes and knew who had died without being told, because they knew the pattern. It knew the code, knew that 3 strikes meant a child, 6 meant a woman, 9 meant a man. And they knew who'd been dying, who'd been sick, whose time had come. Your body was washed by the same hands that had washed your mother's body, your grandmother's body. That would someday wash your children's bodies. You were dressed in clothes saved for this purpose, clothes that might be the finest thing you'd ever worn. You were carried to the church by your neighbors, and the whole village turned out, and you were buried in the churchyard where all your ancestors were buried, where your descendants would someday bury their dead. The same ground receiving generation after generation, the soil rich with the bodies that fed it. The priest said the words over you, the same words said over every Christian death. And then your name was added to the parish register, the same book that recorded your baptism and your marriage, the official record that you had lived, you had mattered, you had been part of this community. And then the bell tolled again, calling the living back to their work, back to the fields and the animals and the endless cycle of survival. But you remained, held in the ground, and the memory and the stories people would tell about you for a generation or two, until you faded into the anonymous mass of the dead, the ancestors, the ones who came before. This is what it meant to belong to a place. Not the sanitized belonging of finding your tribe or discovering your people. The messy, involuntary belonging of being stuck with the same few hundred humans your entire life, whether you liked them or not, whether they liked you or not, was because there was no alternative, no exit, no option to swipe left and find a better community. You were born into these relationships, and you'd die in them, and in between you'd negotiate them with all the skill you could muster, because your survival depended on it. The work was brutal. Let's not romanticize this. Your back hurt all the time. Your hands were scarred and calloused. You watched children die, your children, your neighbors' children, die from diseases we can prevent with a $5 vaccine, die from infections we can cure with antibiotics, die from accidents that could have been prevented with basic safety equipment. You watched women die in childbirth. You watched men die from injuries that wouldn't be fatal today. You lived with pain because there was nothing to do about pain except endure it. You were probably illiterate. Your world extended maybe 20 miles in any direction, and most people never traveled even that far. You didn't know that other ways of life were possible. You accepted hunger as normal, accepted that winter meant cold, accepted that the Lord took most of what you grew, and the church took its share, and you survived on what was left. If you were lucky, if the harvest was good, if God was merciful, you were told how to think. The church mediated your relationship with the divine, and you didn't question it because questioning led to being labeled a heretic, which could get you killed. You were told how to behave, how to dress, how to speak to your betters. The hierarchy was enforced with violence when necessary, public whippings, the stocks, executions for crimes that seem absurdly minor to us now. You lived under layers of authority that demanded obedience, and if you were born a serf, you weren't even legally free to leave, to choose a different life, to imagine yourself as an autonomous individual with rights. This was real. This was the cost. The belonging came packaged with constraint, the security with submission, the community with conformity enforced by social pressure, and sometimes by force. You can't separate them. You can't have the tight-knit community without the gossip and the judgment. You can't have the mutual aid without the mutual surveillance. You can't have the stable identity without the rigid roles. They were a package deal. And yet, when you woke in the morning, you knew why you were waking. The work was hard, but it was yours. Not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of meaning. You could see the direct relationship between your labor and your survival. You planted seeds and you harvested crops, and you ate bread made from grain you grew with your own hands. You tended animals and they gave you milk, eggs, meat, leather, wool. You built your house and your children would live in it. You dug a well and your grandchildren would drink from it. There was a clarity to this that we've lost. Your labor had immediate, visible, tangible results. You weren't optimizing engagement metrics or generating shareholder value or contributing to abstract systems you don't understand. You were doing what humans had always done, coaxing life from the earth, sheltering your family, participating in the cycle of planting and harvest and birth and death that connected you to every human who'd ever lived. And you were doing it with people, not for people, not providing services to customers, but with people. Your neighbor helped you raise your barn, and you helped them bring in their harvest. Your cousin shared the cost of a plow horse. Your sister-in-law taught your daughter to spin. Everything was reciprocal, not in a transactional way, but in a way woven into the fabric of daily life. You helped because you'd need help. You taught because you'd been taught. You gave because you'd been given to. It was a web of mutual obligation so dense and so constant that you probably weren't even conscious of it. It was just how life worked. The bell tower stood at the center of all this. You could see it from anywhere in the village. This vertical assertion of permanence in a world where everything else was temporary. The crops would fail. The animals would die. The people would die. The houses would fall into disrepair and be rebuilt. But the bell tower remained, and the bell within it calling out over the fields and the forests, organizing time, gathering community, marking the moments that mattered. When the bell rang for Sunday service, you stopped what you were doing and you went. And when you walked into the church, you became part of something that extended beyond your individual life. You stood where your parents stood, where their parents stood, in a ritual that connected you backward to the dead and forward to the unborn. The words were ancient. The prayers were the prayers your ancestors prayed. You were participating in something that had survived plague and famine and war, something that would survive you. When the bell rang for a wedding, you went, and you witnessed the joining of two families, two lines, two futures. You danced at the celebration afterward, not performance dancing, but communal dancing where everyone knew the steps because everyone had been doing these same dances for generations. You drank too much and you laughed and you felt the joy of seeing life continue, seeing the pattern repeat, seeing the village renew itself. When the bell rang for a death, you went, and you stood in the churchyard and you were reminded of your own mortality, not in an abstract way, but in the very concrete way of seeing someone you knew return to the earth. You threw dirt on the coffin, you said the prayers, You went back to your house and you felt the weight of it, the knowledge that this would be you someday, that you too would be lowered into that ground, and that the bell would toll for you. The bell knew your name because the person who rang it knew your name. The priest knew your name. Your neighbors knew your name. When you walked through the village, people greeted you, not with the empty, "How are you?" that means nothing, but with real inquiries about real things. How's your mother's cough? Did the cow calve yet? Are you going to the market tomorrow? Small questions, daily questions, the constant texture of being known. And this knowing was not always comfortable. They knew when you drank too much. They knew when your marriage was unhappy. They knew when you were struggling to pay your debts. They knew your weaknesses and your failures, and they judged you for them, sometimes harshly. But they also knew when you needed help, and they helped. Because the system only worked if everyone participated, if everyone upheld their end of the vast network of mutual obligation that held the village together. You couldn't opt out. That's the crucial thing we forget. You couldn't decide you were an introvert who needed space. You couldn't move away and reinvent yourself. You couldn't choose your relationships or curate your community. You were stuck with these people, and they were stuck with you, and you all had to figure out how to live together because there was no alternative. This created a kind of intimacy we've completely lost. Not the intimacy of chosen affection, but the intimacy of unavoidable proximity. You knew these people at their worst: sick, grieving, angry, afraid. You saw them in ways they couldn't control or curate. You had no choice but to develop the skills of tolerance and negotiation and forgiveness. Because holding a grudge meant living in constant misery when you had to see the person every single day for the rest of your life. The village was a container for the entire human experience. Birth happened here in houses everyone knew. Childhood happened here in streets where everyone watched everyone's children and corrected them when they misbehaved and helped them when they struggled. Adolescence happened here, with all its awkwardness witnessed by everyone. Courtship happened here, under the eyes of two families and the whole village. Marriage happened here, and then the long middle years of work and child rearing, of illness and recovery, of success and failure, all of it witnessed, all of it held in the collective memory. And death happened here, not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but in the house, in the bed, in full view. Children saw death. They saw the old get older, saw the sick get sicker, saw the dying die. Death was not an abstraction or a surprise. It was part of the pattern, expected, prepared for, woven into the rhythm of life. You saved pennies for your funeral. You made arrangements. You knew how it would go because you'd been to 100 funerals before your own, and when your time came, people would do for you what you'd done for others. The bell would ring. People would gather. The priest would say the words. The earth would receive you. Your name would be added to the register. And life would go on, would have to go on, because the crops didn't care that you died, the animals still needed feeding, the children still needed raising. Your family would grieve, but they'd also keep working, because grief was something you carried while continuing to live, not something that stopped time. This is what we mean when we talk about being held by a community. Not that life was easier, it wasn't. Not that people were kinder, they often weren't. But that you existed within a structure that acknowledged your existence, that had a place for you, that would mark your passing, that couldn't simply close over you as if you'd never been. The question we're trying to understand is not whether that life was better. In most material ways, it was obviously worse. The question is what they had that we don't, what we lost when we gained everything else. And what they had, what the bell represented, was the assurance that your life was witnessed, that you were part of a story larger than yourself, that your presence mattered and your absence would be felt. The bell didn't make life easier. It didn't make people immortal or protect them from suffering, but it anchored them. It placed them. It gave them, for better and worse, a context, a role, a reason to get up in the morning that extended beyond their own desires or ambitions. It connected them to the people around them, and to the people who came before, and to the people who would come after. It made them, in the deepest sense, less alone. But the bell is silent now. Not broken, not missing, just irrelevant. The tower still stands in some villages, preserved as heritage, maintained by historical societies, visited by tourists who take photos and move on. The mechanism still works. You could ring it if you wanted to. But who would gather? Who would stop their work and listen and understand what it meant? The language has been lost. The grammar of collective time, of communal attention, of shared rhythm, we don't speak it anymore. This didn't happen overnight. The village didn't disappear in a single catastrophic event. It eroded, slowly, across generations as conditions changed and people adapted and new possibilities emerged. The Industrial Revolution created factories, and factories needed workers, and workers left the land, left the villages, crowded into cities where they sold their labour for wages and used those wages to buy things they used to make themselves. The arrangement was different. The rhythms were different. The relationships were different. In the city, you could be anonymous in a way that was impossible in the village. No one knew your family or your history or your business unless you told them. This was terrifying to people at first, this untethering from the known world. But it was also liberating. You could fail without everyone knowing. You could reinvent yourself. You could escape the role you were born into and become something else. Someone else. The city required new skills, new ways of being human. You had to learn to navigate among strangers, to interact with people whose background and beliefs and daily rhythms were completely different from yours. You had to learn to negotiate based on individual merit rather than family connection. You had to develop a self that could function without the constant reflection of people who'd known you since birth. This was hard. The early cities were brutal places, overcrowded, unsanitary, dangerous, anonymous in ways that bred both freedom and violence. People died young and alone. The mutual aid networks that had sustained village life didn't translate. Churches tried to fill the gap, but they couldn't replicate the involuntary intimacy of the village, the web of obligation that came from being stuck together. But gradually, over time, new structures emerged. Unions organised workers and created new forms of solidarity based on shared labour rather than shared geography. Fraternal organisations created community for men unmoored from their families. Churches adapted to urban life, becoming less about comprehensive social control and more about voluntary spiritual community. The city learned to be less hostile, though it never became home in the way the village was home. And then we kept going. We got more efficient, more mobile, and more connected across distance and disconnected up close. We built suburbs where each family had their own house, their own yard, their own car, their own television, bringing the world into their living room so they didn't have to go out into the street. We built highways that let you drive from home to work without seeing anyone. We built shopping malls where you could buy everything you needed without talking to anyone who knew you. We invented technologies that let you work from home, shop from home, date from home, be entertained from home. We made it possible to live a full life without ever having to negotiate with neighbours or participate in community or show up in person for anything. We made privacy absolute and convenience paramount and individual choice the highest good. We won. We got everything we thought we wanted. And here you are, alone in your apartment at 2 a.m, scrolling through the lives of people you barely know, feeling the ache of something you can't name, some hunger that all your freedom and choice and privacy hasn't satisfied. Here you are, technically able to connect with anyone in the world, but unable to connect meaningfully with the person in the apartment next door. Here you are, with more options than any human in history, paralyzed by choice, unsure what you even want because you've been so focused on what's possible that you've forgotten to ask what would actually make you feel less alone. The nostalgia you feel and you do feel it, don't pretend you don't, isn't really for the past. You don't actually want to give up antibiotics and die at 40 from an infected tooth. You don't want to be trapped in an arranged marriage or bound to land you don't own or forbidden from questioning the authorities who rule your life. You don't want the surveillance or the conformity or the violence that enforced village norms. What you want is the feeling the village gave, the sense of being part of something, of mattering to something, of being held by something larger than your individual will. You want what the bell represented, the organization of life around communal rhythms, the assurance that someone would notice your absence, the knowledge that your existence was woven into the fabric of other lives in ways that couldn't be easily undone. But you want it without the cost. You want community without obligation, belonging without constraint, intimacy without proximity, meaning without sacrifice. You want to be known but only on your terms, loved but with exit options, connected but autonomous. You want it all, and you want it now, and you want it without having to give up anything you value. This is the impossible position of the modern human. You've been taught that you can have it all, that the right combination of choices and effort and optimization will give you both freedom and belonging, both autonomy and intimacy, both the liberation of the city and the warmth of the village. But these things might be in fundamental tension. The conditions that create deep belonging might be incompatible with the conditions that create individual freedom. You might have to choose, or maybe not choose because you've already chosen. You chose with your feet when you moved to the city for opportunity. You chose with your attention when you turned to your phone instead of your neighbor. You chose with your values when you prioritized career mobility over geographic stability, personal growth over role acceptance, authentic self-expression over social conformity. These weren't wrong choices. But they were choices, and choices have consequences, and one consequence is that you live in a world where the bell has no one to call. The village survives in pockets, in small towns that haven't yet been absorbed into the sprawl, in immigrant communities that recreate the old patterns in new contexts, in religious communities that choose constraint as the price of belonging. You could join them. You could move to a small town, join a church, stay put long enough to become known. You could trade your freedom for place, your mobility for mattering. But you probably won't, because you've tasted the freedom and it's sweet, even when it's lonely, because you've learned to value choice above almost everything else. And the village doesn't offer choice. It offers role and duty and obligation. Because you can't unsee what you've seen, can't unknow what you know, can't go back to accepting constraints that you now understand are contingent rather than necessary. So you're stuck in this in-between place, mourning a loss you never personally experienced, longing for a belonging you're not willing to pay for, carrying an ache that has no solution because what you want doesn't exist, and maybe never did, not in the pure form you imagine, not without all the suffering and limitation you're not willing to accept. This ache is not a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be understood. It's the price we pay for modernity, the toll for all the goods we've gained. We live longer, healthier, freer, more self-determined lives than any humans in history. We have options our ancestors couldn't dream of. We've escaped so many of the constraints that made their lives brutal and short. But we've also escaped the structures that made their lives meaningful in ways ours often aren't. The bell rang for them, and they knew what it meant, and they gathered, and they participated in something larger than themselves. The bell is silent for you, and you gather only by choice. When it's convenient, when the app sends a notification, when the algorithm suggests it, and you can always leave, always opt out, always choose yourself over the collective. And this freedom is both your liberation and your loneliness. There's no going back. That world is gone, not just in practice, but in possibility. You can't unknow what modernity has taught you about human rights and individual autonomy and the contingency of tradition. You can't unsee the violence that enforced the old orders. You can't unfeel the expansion of moral concern that now extends beyond your village to encompass all of humanity. You've eaten the fruit. You're expelled from the garden. The angel with the flaming sword stands at the gate. But maybe, you can carry forward something of what that world understood. Maybe you can build new structures that create belonging without requiring submission, that foster community without demanding conformity, that give people a place in the world without trapping them in that place. Maybe the solution isn't to choose between freedom and belonging, but to imagine new arrangements that honor both. This would require sacrifice. Not the sacrifice of returning to the village, but the sacrifice of showing up, staying put, investing in place and people, even when it's inconvenient, even when you'd rather be elsewhere, even when the relationship is difficult and the community is flawed and the commitment is costly. It would require choosing depth over breadth, staying over moving, the slow work of building something over time rather than the quick hit of novelty and change. It would require being known, really known, in ways that make you vulnerable. It would require letting people see your failures and your struggles, and trusting that they'll help rather than judge. It would require helping others when they fail and struggle, and not because you feel like it, but because that's what community demands. It would require showing up for things that bore you, tolerating people who annoy you, working through conflicts instead of ghosting, staying in conversation instead of blocking and moving on. It would require, in other words, acting as if you live in a village even though you live in a city. It would require creating voluntary structures that mimic the involuntary intimacy of the old world. It would require discipline and patience, and the willingness to let relationship matter more than convenience. Some people do this. They join churches or community centres or mutual aid networks. They organise block parties and babysitting co-ops and tool libraries. They show up for neighbourhood meetings and school functions and local politics. They invest in place, in people, in the slow accumulation of shared history that eventually becomes belonging. It's not the same as the village. It doesn't have the same inevitability, the same taken-for-granted quality. But it's something. It's the attempt to build connection in a world organised around disconnection. Most people don't do this. Most people, most of the time, choose the path of least resistance, which is the path of individualism, of keeping to yourself, of interacting only when necessary, and only on your terms. This is rational. It's easier. It requires less vulnerability, less risk, less sustained effort, but it also reproduces the loneliness you're trying to escape, the sense of drifting through a life that no one else particularly notices or needs you in. The bell can't call you anymore. That much is true. The old structures are gone and they're not coming back. But you can call yourself. You can show up. You can stay. You can do the work of making yourself matter to a place and letting a place matter to you. It won't feel the same as the village. It won't have the same depth or density or inevitability. But it might, over time, give you something approximating what you're longing for. A place in the world, a web of relation, a reason to believe that your presence matters and your absence would be felt. Or you can keep scrolling, keep moving, keep optimizing for freedom and choice and the perfect life that's always just out of reach. Keep the bells silent and your calendar empty of obligations, and your relationships light and portable and easy to exit. This is also a choice, and it's yours to make. No one is forcing you into community. No one is demanding that you belong. You're free. You're so free. The question is whether freedom is enough, whether it's what you actually want deep down, or whether it's what you've been taught to want by a culture that profits from your isolation and your hunger, and your endless search for something to fill the void. The question is whether the ache you feel at 3 a.m. is something to be medicated or something to be listened to, whether it's telling you that something's wrong with you, or whether it's telling you that something's wrong with how we've organized life. The village couldn't answer these questions for you. It didn't ask. You were born into a place, and a role and a web of relationships, and that was that. The questions weren't questions because there were no alternatives. But you have alternatives. You have nothing but alternatives. And so you have to decide over and over what kind of life you want to live, what you're willing to sacrifice for it, what it means to be human in a world where belonging is optional and community is something you have to choose and fight for and build rather than something you simply receive by virtue of being born. The bell is silent, but your life isn't over. You still have time to decide what you want, to act on it, to build something that might eventually feel like home. You still have time to become known, to know others, to create the structures of mutual dependence that make existence feel less fragile, less provisional, less alone. You still have time to answer the question of what you are when no one is watching by becoming someone who shows up, who's seen, or who matters to the people around you because you've chosen to matter, because you've done the work. Or you can keep waiting, keep searching, keep longing for something that was lost before you were born, something you never had and never can have, not in its original form, not in this world. You can nurse the ache and scroll through the photos and imagine that somewhere, somehow, there's a place where you'd feel less alone, where belonging wouldn't require so much work, where you could just be and be held without having to do anything to earn it. But that place doesn't exist. It never existed. Not really. Not without cost. The village held you, but it also constrained you. The bell called you, but it also commanded you. The community knew you, but it also judged you. There is no pure belonging, no costless connection, and no way to be held that doesn't also bind you. What there is, what there's always been, is the hard work of being human among other humans, of negotiating the tension between self and society, freedom and belonging, autonomy and intimacy. The forms change, the structures evolve. The bell goes silent, and new technologies emerge to organize our attention and our time. But the fundamental question remains: how do we live together? How do we matter to each other? How do we create lives that feel meaningful and connected in whatever world we find ourselves in? The village had one answer. We've discarded it, mostly for good reasons. But we haven't yet found a new answer, or at least not one that satisfies the ancient human hunger for place and purpose and participation in something larger than the self. We're still figuring it out. You're still experimenting, still building and tearing down and rebuilding, still lonely, still longing, still human. The bell knew your name once, in a world that doesn't exist anymore. The question now is whether you can learn to call yourself, to answer your own call, to show up for the life you have instead of the life you imagine. The question is whether you can build something that lasts in a world organized around impermanence, whether you can create depth in a culture of surfaces, whether you can choose belonging even when it's not required, even when it costs you something, even when you could just as easily stay home and scroll and stay safe in your isolation. The light is fading now. Not the literal light. You're probably in bed with the curtains drawn, the blue glow of your phone the only illumination, but the metaphorical light. The energy you came here with, the restlessness that drove you to seek answers, to understand, to figure out why you feel the way you feel. You're tired. The thinking is getting harder. The words are starting to blur together. This is good. This is what you came for. Let yourself settle. Let the questions rest. You don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't have to figure out how to recreate the village in the city, or how to build community in a world of strangers, or how to make your life feel less provisional. Those are daytime questions, and the daytime will come again, and you can think about them then. Right now, just let yourself be tired. Let yourself be human. Let yourself rest. Think about the bell one more time. Not the real bell in the real village, but the idea of the bell, the thing it represented, a call to attention, or a gathering, a reminder that you're part of something larger than yourself, even if you can't always see it or feel it. The bell rang for your ancestors, and they stopped what they were doing, and they listened, and they came together. The bell is silent for you, but the impulse remains. The hunger for that gathering, that attention, that sense of being called. Maybe that's enough for now. Not to have the gathering, but to acknowledge the hunger. Not to solve the loneliness, but to understand it. Not to fix what's broken, but to see it clearly, without judgment, without the pressure to make it different than it is. You are lonely sometimes. You feel unmoored. You long for something you can't quite name. This is not a failing. This is the human condition in the early 21st century. This is what it feels like to be alive right now. What's in this world, with these freedoms and these costs? Your ancestors lived differently. They had different freedoms and different costs. They knew where they belonged, but they couldn't leave. They were held, but they were also trapped. They participated in something larger, but they paid for it with their autonomy, their privacy, their right to become whoever they might have been if they'd had the chance. You have chances they never had. You have freedoms they died never knowing were possible. But you also have longings they never felt, because they never had to wonder where they belonged. The question didn't arise. The answer was given at birth. You have to find your own answers now. Build your own belonging. Create your own place in a world that doesn't automatically give you one. This is harder. It requires more from you. But it also means that when you do build something, when you do create connections that matter and communities that hold you, they're chosen rather than assigned. They're yours in a way the village never could have been. They reflect who you are rather than where you were born. This is cold comfort at 3 in the morning when you're lying awake feeling like you don't belong anywhere. But it's true comfort nonetheless. You get to decide. You get to choose. You get to build something that fits who you are rather than contorting yourself to fit what already exists. The price is that you have to do the building yourself. The gift is that what you build is actually yours. But you don't have to build it tonight. Tonight, you can just rest. You can let your body sink into the mattress, let your mind slow down. Yeah, let the questions fade into the background. You can acknowledge the loneliness without letting it consume you. You can feel the longing without having to satisfy it right this moment. You can be human and imperfect and unfinished. And that's okay. That's more than okay. That's what everyone is, even though we don't usually admit it. The bell tower stands empty in the village square. The mechanism is still there. The rope hangs ready. But no one pulls it anymore, because no one needs to be called. Everyone has their own notifications now, their own alarms, their own personalized reminders of what to do and when. The communal call has been replaced by the individual ping. The shared rhythm has been replaced by the customized schedule. This is loss, but it's also gain. You lose the gathering, but you gain control over your time. And you lose the intimacy, but you gain the privacy. You lose the place, but you gain the mobility. Try not to think in terms of better or worse. Just different. Just what is. The world you live in is the world you live in. You can wish it were different, and that wishing might even motivate you to change small pieces of it, to build different arrangements, to create pockets of connection in the vast anonymity. But you can't undo modernity. You can't uninvent the technologies that dissolved the village. You can't unknow what you know about human rights and individual autonomy and the violence that maintained the old orders. So you're here, in this moment, in this bed, in this city, in this life. You're here with your freedoms and your loneliness, your choices and your uncertainty, and your hunger for belonging, and your unwillingness to pay the full price for it. You're here, and that's enough. You don't have to be anything more than here right now. You don't have to solve anything or fix anything or become anything. You can just be tired and human and ready for sleep. Imagine the bell one last time. Imagine you can hear it, faint and far away, ringing not for any practical reason, but just because. Ringing just to ring, just to send sound out into the world, just to mark this moment. You're lying in bed. The day is over, the work is done, or at least postponed until tomorrow. The thoughts are settling, the questions are quieting. The bell rings, once, twice, 3 times, and then stops. And the silence that follows is not empty, but full of all the things you don't have to figure out right now. So full of all the questions you don't have to answer. Your name is written somewhere, even if not in a parish register, even if not in collective memory that will last generations. You exist. You've left traces. People know you, even if not in the comprehensive way the village knew its members. You've been seen. You've mattered. Maybe not as much as you'd like. Maybe not in the ways you wish. But you've been here. You've participated in this strange experiment of modern human life. You've negotiated the tension between freedom and belonging as best you could with the tools you had. That's enough. It has to be enough. Because it's what you have. Because it's what we all have. This imperfect life in an imperfect world. And doing our best to connect and to matter and to build something that feels like home, even when nothing feels quite like home anymore. We're all trying. We're all longing. We're all carrying the same ache, the same hunger for something we can barely articulate, something that maybe can't be satisfied in this world we've built. But we're here together in this longing, if nowhere else. You're not alone in feeling alone. You're not the only one lying awake at 3 a.m, wondering why freedom feels so much like drift, why choice feels so much like paralysis, why having everything feels so much like having nothing that matters. Millions of us are doing this, all of us carrying the same ghost, the same memory of a belonging we never had, the same longing for a place in the world that was never really available to us. Not without costs we're not willing to pay. This is the strange comfort of modernity. We're alone together, isolated in identical ways, longing for the same lost thing. The bell doesn't ring for us, but we can hear its silence together, can acknowledge together that something's missing, that the world we've built is magnificent and terrible and wondrous and lonely all at once. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the thinking stop. Let the questioning rest. Let your body be heavy and your breathing slow, and your mind drift toward whatever images want to come. Maybe you dream of villages you've never seen. Maybe you dream of bells ringing over valleys you've never walked through. Maybe you dream of being known by people whose faces you can't quite see, but whose presence feels like coming home. These dreams are not problems to solve or longings to fulfill. They're just dreams. They're your unconscious mind processing the ache, working through the tension, trying to imagine what belonging might feel like in a world that doesn't quite know how to hold you. Let them come. Let them wash over you. Let them carry you down into sleep, down into the place where questions don't need answers and longings don't need to be satisfied. And you can just be, suspended in the warm dark, held by nothing but your own body and the soft rhythm of your breathing. The bell tower is empty. The village is gone. The old ways have dissolved into history. But you remain, human, longing, alive, here, now, in this moment, in this bed, in this life that's yours even when it doesn't feel like enough, even when you wish it were different, even when you can't quite figure out how to make it feel like home. You remain. And that's the beginning and the end of it. You remain. And tomorrow you'll wake, and the day will come with its demands and its possibilities, and you'll navigate them as best you can. And maybe you'll choose connection over isolation. Maybe you'll show up for something, even when it's inconvenient. Maybe you'll take one small step toward building the belonging you long for. Or maybe you won't. Maybe tomorrow will be like today, like yesterday, like all the days that blur together into a life. Either way, you'll have time. Time to decide, time to choose, time to build or not build, to connect or stay isolated, to answer the call you're hearing even though no bell is ringing. You have time. Not infinite time. None of us do. But enough time. Enough to take a step. Enough to show up. Enough to try. But not tonight. Tonight is for rest. For letting go. For sinking into the dark and trusting that you'll surface again in the morning. That the world will still be here. That you'll still be here. That the ache will still be here. But so will the possibility of doing something about it. However small. However imperfect. The bell is silent. Your breathing is slow. The thoughts are spacing out, coming slower, losing their urgency. You're drifting now, hovering in that space between waking and sleep, where everything feels a little softer, a little less sharp, a little more possible. Your body is heavy. Your mind is quiet. The questions are settling into the background like sediment sinking to the bottom of a still pond. You can almost hear it now, can't you? The bell. Not a real bell, but the memory of a bell, the idea of a bell, ringing somewhere far away in a place you've never been, calling people you've never met to a gathering you'll never attend. But you can hear it anyway, faint and clear, marking time, marking place, marking the simple fact of existence, of being here, of being alive in this moment. Ring, pause, ring, pause, ring. The sound fades, but the silence it leaves is not empty. It's full of possibility, full of rest, full of the understanding that tomorrow is another day, and tonight is just for sleep, just for letting go, just for being held by nothing but the dark and the quiet, and your own tired body, finally ready to rest. Let the bell ring, let it fade, let the silence hold you. Let sleep come, soft and slow, inevitable as dawn, gentle as the last light leaving the sky. Let yourself go, or let yourself rest. Let yourself be, for this moment, for this night, enough exactly as you are. The bell knew your name once, in a world that's gone. But you know your own name now. You know where you are. You know, somewhere deep down, that you'll find your way, that you'll build something, that you'll figure out how to live in this strange world we've inherited. But not tonight. Tonight, you just rest. The village sleeps. The bell is quiet. And so, finally, are you.